Good morning. My name's Lachlan. I will be narrating the presentation on behalf of Team Aspen, who is made up of Alandra, Caius, Garrett, and myself. Our project is all about native and non-invasive plants in the landscape, which is most of them. So we decided to focus on pollinators, both native and domesticated varieties, and their relationship with the plants in our gardens. So the first thing to talk about is definitions, the definition of a native plant and a non-invasive plant. The USDA describes a native plant, paraphrasing, as a native plant is one that has existed in a particular location for hundreds or thousands of years, basically. And they describe a non-native plant as simply one that has been brought to a location that it did not originally naturally occur. And depending on the biology and environmental conditions of the region, it was not able to become invasive or weedy. So introduced plants can potentially become invasive and weedy, and those are not ones that we'll be covering in here because the idea is those shouldn't be in your garden, even though dandelions are awesome. So a couple historical gardens to tell you guys about in our region, which the region we're focusing on is I'll say central Alberta, so kind of in Edmonton to Calgary and kind of around those areas sort of type places. So the first one is the Reader's Rock Garden in Calgary, which was started in 1913 by William Roland Reader on the backside of a cemetery. He was the superintendent for parks, and basically started collecting wildflowers and then also cultivated varieties to start growing to basically see what could grow there, and if stuff was successful he sent it off to have it propagated and then plant it in throughout the city in parks and stuff. So that garden fell into disrepair in 1944, a year after his death in 1943, and wasn't revisited by the city until 2004. And at that time it was reconstructed and replanted, and now has become quite a well-established, nice little place close to the core of the city. So another historical garden to tell you about is the University of Alberta Botanical Gardens, constructed in 1959, and are made up of a bunch of different themed gardens, including Aga Khan, Indigenous Gardens, an indoor tropical garden, and the Kurimoto Japanese Garden, and an alpine garden. And both of these gardens are terrific examples of how, whether or not they knew what they were doing at the time, they were supporting biodiversity, pollinators, beneficial insects, wildlife, and continue to do that to this day. So there are many different kinds of native bees in our region, and even more in Alberta, and even more in Canada. Many of them are pretty small and maybe resemble wasps or some kind of weird fly or something. And many of them act as pollinators. So some of these include digger bees, bumblebees, which are probably the best known, sweat bees, cuckoo bees, plaster bees, and leafcutter bees. Now, part of what makes native bees special is some of them have very specific relationships with particular native plants. So, for example, the calypso orchid, Calypso bulbosa, or the fairy slipper orchid, needs to be pollinated by queen bumblebees in the early spring. And the trick is that they have all the stuff that draws them in to pollinate them, but they don't actually produce nectar to feed the bees. So after the queen bee has visited a few flowers, she realizes that there's no reason for her to go there. There's no nectar for her, so she stops visiting them. And for the next, 2 or 3 seasons that she's alive and out in the spring, she won't visit that orchid again. So the orchid relies on queen bumblebees coming out in their first season before they've learned that those flowers are no good. And it's that kind of close relationship that makes it tough when you have cultivated, monocultured cropland that destroys much of the original bee habitat and the flowers that live there and the complex relationships, so that species of bees or flowers ultimately disappear or are, kind of sent back into shelter belts and ditches where they can eke out a living. And cultivated crops such as canola and alfalfa, they can be utilized by generalist pollinators, like a lot of bumblebees and stuff. But and even for honeybees, it's not healthy for them to feed on the one type of nectar and pollen from the one type of flower, just as it's not healthy for human beings to live off one particular piece of food. So the domesticated pollinator we'll be talking about today is the European honeybee, which comes from Europe. Now these are the bees that produce all the honey and pollen and beeswax that we use in products. But the problem that they can have sometimes with these guys is now honeybees are great for humans, but the big problem they pose is they very directly compete with very many native species for food resources, some for habitat, and they can also vector diseases and parasites that can wipe out native bee species. Now something kind of interesting about honeybees and for many native bees as well, bumblebees for sure, is that as they fly, they build up a positive charge, and when they land on flowers, which are usually negatively charged, the pollen literally jumps from the flower and sticks to the bee, and then they can scrape themselves down and press it into their baskets, and the positive and negative charge of the bee and flower are neutralized, and it takes a while for that charge to build back up. So it's thought that the bees are actually able to perceive the electric field to tell whether or not a flower has been visited recently, and whether it's very likely to have nectar or if it has to be left for a time to replenish. So bees are awesome, but there's also other pollinators like butterflies. So there's like monarch butterflies in southern Alberta that are going to be feeding on milkweed, and the adults will feed on different flowers. Morning cloak butterfly, who feed on sap and willow catkins for pollen and nectar, and the caterpillars eat the willow too, which seems convenient. Meadow fritillary, who love feeding on flowers from the daisy family and who deposit their eggs on violets because that's what their caterpillars like to eat. There's also clouded sulfur butterflies who feed on nectar from raspberries, delphinium, violets, and their caterpillars like to eat alfalfa and clover. Now butterflies generally don't have the specialized pollen baskets that bees have, but they have hairy little bodies covered in bristles that will collect and hold the pollen so that as they go from plant to plant, they still perform the pollination. It's just a little more chaotic. So in addition to insects, there are also birds that act as pollinators. There's hummingbirds in Alberta, such as the ruby-throated hummingbird, which feeds on tubular flowers such as wild bergamot or cultivated bee balm in gardens as well, lilies, paintbrush, wild columbine, and others, and they also eat insects. And there's another type called the rufous hummingbird, which probably feeds on similar flowers. And they're both going to be a migratory species, passing through in the summer, and they transfer pollen by getting it stuck on their little faces, and then when next time they stick their face into another flower, they transfer that pollen in there. So in addition to the main ones, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, there are also all other kinds of pollinators, different kinds of insects, such as the hummingbird moth, which is a moth and not a bird, and different kinds of wasps will feed on nectar and pollen from flowers, acting as pollinators. And then there's flies, beetles, basically anybody that goes into a flower for some reason is probably going to end up getting pollen on them and will pollinate the next flower it wanders into. So here's a chart we found that outlines the potential positive and negative effects of bringing in outside plant matter and how it can affect native species. Basically, the concerns are that you get a plant that you didn't think was invasive that manages to escape the garden and become kind of invasive. The other concern is that they end up hogging all the pollinators. If the pollinators seem to prefer the introduced flower, maybe the native flowers aren't getting enough attention. The other concern is that if you bring in a cultivated variety of a native flower, or one that comes from the other side of the continent, that they have different genetic material, and you may dilute the native locality genetic material. On the plus side, and what we're hoping to do when we do our flower plantings, is create tons of habitat that can support a healthy population of pollinators that can then support a larger population, a stronger population of surrounding native wildflowers. So the three planting settings that we'll be covering are residential landscapes, remediation landscapes, and institutional landscapes. So in a residential, there's a lot of opportunity for people to express themselves artistically or whatever. So here we can see that we've got the spectrum from people that went whole hog and planted their whole garden to people that, just chose a bed along the side of the lawn. Still though, it's less lawn, so that's technically a win. Residential gardens can basically become as complicated and extravagant as the owner is willing to upkeep. So you can do xeriscaping with minimum water use and focus on native plants that don't require much attention in the right setting. Or you can go right into ornamental varieties and really plant it up diversely, and then you start getting into more interesting gardens that can create habitat for humans as well as wildlife and pollinators, such as food forests and that kind of thing. In remediation landscapes, basically you are trying to replace the nature that was there before it was destroyed, either by human beings on the left pictures there, or by nature on the right picture there. So that's either by industry or a catastrophic natural event like the huge flood in the Calgary area of 2013. So this is where native plant material really has its strengths, because it's what has evolved to live in those sites. And when you're trying to recreate as best you can the native habitat that existed before, you need those native species to support the native pollinators. The third landscaping setting we're going to talk about is institutional landscapes, and by that we mean landscapes for private business, government-owned businesses or programs, schools, hospitals, all those sorts of places that benefit from having nicely planted gardens with native and non-invasive species of plants to support pollinators. Now, what you plant is going to be very dependent on what the client needs. So if it's a business and they just want something that's nice to go in front of their office that they don't want to have to manage much, then you're going to maybe be looking towards native species that can handle less water and all that kind of thing. And then you have the opportunities to select for species that are supportive to pollinators. On the other hand, if you were planting for a schoolyard or something like that, then you're going to start by planting material that is, first of all, extremely hardy, that can handle getting trampled and children thrown into it and hung off of, and all kinds of nonsense like that. The other concern that people have too is toxic plants in a schoolyard, which I would suggest maybe avoid very toxic plants, but a little bit of kick in the butt from Mother Nature is good for kids. The other good thing about the institutional gardens is just like the green roof we visited on our field trip, they create an oasis of habitat in what could very often be a complete desert of concrete, like in downtown Red Deer, creating a stronghold for native pollinators to be able to expand outward from. So the benefits and liabilities of planting flowers. Well, for benefits, there are, as pictured there, there's honey from my urban hive, there's berries, which would have been pollinated by maybe my bees, but also probably a lot of native bees. We are creating habitat for native pollinators to thrive, to try to mitigate that competition that domestic honeybees push on them. And just generally, we're creating a lot of habitat for all kinds of beneficial insects and wildlife in general. Pictured on the right there is the meadow down by the Bow River. It has basically just become naturalized with all kinds of legumes and grasses and stuff like that. And it creates habitat that a manicured lawn does not, as a lawn is just an urban desert, basically. So for liabilities for native and non-invasive species, we're literally trying to think of problems with planting flowers, which honestly, there's not a lot. You know, for native plants and ornamental material, expense is probably the biggest problem. If you plant the wrong plants in the wrong place, you're going to increase upkeep costs and time to upkeep those gardens. So if they're not thought out properly, that could be a problem. And sometimes, especially native gardens, will take time to establish and really become spectacular. The other concern is, as we mentioned earlier, with introducing plants from other places, you could be bringing in disease, you're bringing your plant into an ecosystem, you're not sure how it's going to affect it or if it will, you know, draw pollinators into it and away from native species. But that is why it's important to mix native and ornamental species in the garden and not just focus on one necessarily. So unique components of planted gardens, starting with materials. The value of mulch cannot be overstated. Mulch, especially when it's native leaf litter and not a decorative gravel or bark, is okay, but honestly, the leaves that are coming off the plants and creating that natural layer provide an excellent place for pollinators to overwinter, to hibernate, other beneficials to live. That will help deal with pests, water retention, wind erosion, nutrients coming back into the soil. Really, they're absolutely great. And in the upper left there, we have a picture from my garden of ladybugs overwintering in the mulch. I think that picture was taken in the spring, but it was just loaded with them. We also want to look at hardscaping features like stones, logs, different types of sand and gravel that we can incorporate into the garden to create diverse habitats like what we would see in nature, to promote that biodiversity. On the right there, I've got a picture of my neighbor's really old dugout that's completely naturalized in now with plants and insects, and it just represents how adding water to a landscape could be an additional, I'll say, hardscaping feature that can just generally enrich the environment and the habitat for pollinators and beneficials. So when planting a garden for pollinators, you're going to want to select a variety of plants, including both native and non-invasive ornamentals, both for yourself and for the pollinators. You're going to want to try to create a continuous flowering cycle from spring to fall, because there's always somebody out that's looking for some nectar. It's best to plant in blocks of color, so instead of having one specimen plant that's supposed to be a terrific bee plant and you never see bees on, it's probably because it's just too small. It's not worth their time. So you plant blocks of color, that's the trick. And then try to avoid, excessive chemical use, especially pesticides, because those literally kill bugs, which is what we're trying to get more of in the garden. So in conclusion, when landscaping, we can choose our plant material and combine native and non-invasive plants to create an environment that can sustain native pollinators as well as domesticated pollinators, which in turn will help sustain us. And we can plant gardens that help sustain us more directly as well. So that is the end of Team Aspen's presentation. Thank you for listening. And remember, grow food, not lawns.